Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you all here. My name is Emily Mooney, and I am from the Wellesley Institute, working on a project to address research and collaboration in the immigrant and refugee serving sector. Glad to see so many of you here today. It's been really difficult to connect with everyone in the sector when we're in such different places. So I really appreciate the opportunity from OCASI to participate in this conference today. And especially thank you to Stephanie Brown, the amazing conference organizer, for putting this all together today. I will be taking questions throughout the presentation. There will also be some time for discussion at a couple of points. And I wanted to let you know that the presentation will be in two parts. The first is a report on the recent needs assessment that we did about the state of research in the sector since the start of the pandemic. The second part will be a discussion of community partnerships, and especially with a strong emphasis on community-based research. I don't know how many of you have been actively involved in research, what your level of knowledge is, what your level of familiarity. So this will be a pretty introductory section about the community-based research, and we will be offering training in research for frontline workers later this year or early next year. So I'll begin by sharing my screen and we'll get the presentation underway. So settlement research, what's in it for me? What do you as frontline workers get out of research, and how do you apply it to your work? How do you participate in it actively? I am part of the Community Knowledge Program. I'm the project lead. This is a project left over from the days of CIRIS, and we'll get into a bit more discussion of what that was and what it means. First, a bit of a word about the Wellesley Institute, because some of you may not be familiar with us and the work that we do. We are a health and health policy, research and policy think tank, working to improve health and health equity in the GTA with a specific focus and action on the social determinants of health. Social determinants of health, including things like housing, access to employment, all of those things that we know contribute directly to people's health and well-being. So for this workshop, we're going to talk about what the role of research is in settlement work, the findings of the recent needs assessment in the sector. And as I mentioned, you'll learn more about community-based research, which will help you strengthen mutually respectful and long-term research relationships across the sector. So just very quickly, when you hear the phrase settlement research, what comes to mind? You can type a little bit into the chat. You can indicate in any way when you hear about settlement research, or you don't even have to answer. Just think about what images come to mind when you think of this. I know that if you enter the word research on an iPhone, a little microscope comes up, which is both a useful metaphor and also not a particularly helpful piece of physical equipment for research in settlement work. In the chat, I'm seeing some interesting ideas here. A study of the issue that is new to you. Yeah, exploring means for settlement work, policies and practice, learning about integration, policy analysis. Okay, these are great, thank you. Needs of newcomers, yes, that is absolutely central. What do newcomers need? Collecting data, yes, and we will talk about that as well. Demographics, needs, practical services. And I want to thank the person who mentioned practical services, because this is something that we found very much in the needs assessment, is that there is a gap between research and practice. So yes, designing welcoming contexts, looking at data, quantitative, qualitative data gathered from programs, and analyzing that data. This is great. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. So for the next slide, how does research affect your day-to-day work? How does it influence your day-to-day work? Where and how do you learn about recent research? I know that you're all here, so you are at a conference where you're learning about recent research. Are there other ways that you have learned about it? Do you participate in research studies? And from the chat, I see that some of you are definitely using research to shape your programs and services. Yeah, Lisette, thank you for mentioning outcomes and deep knowledge, Jane. Yes. So we need to know what newcomers need so that we can serve them well, and so that we can understand if the services that are provided for them are effective and responsive and actually meet their needs both in the short term and in the longer term as they continue to settle and integrate into Canada. So why should you know about research? Well, as I'm sure you're all aware, the current trends in migration determine who is going to show up at your agency, who is going to be at the door. There's 40,000 people on there coming from Afghanistan in the present and in the near future. What kind of supports are they likely to need? What are the most pressing needs for them? What kind of culturally specific help are they going to need? Research can let you know, it can tell you if your services are effective. If you are trying to provide services to meet one need and all of your participants are indicating that that need is not being met, then clearly you need to rethink things. Furthermore, you can participate in research, and this is key to a lot of what our program is designed to achieve. Is bringing frontline workers into research as active, engaged participants. You can let academic researchers who really shape in many ways the form of the discourse and the direction of the discourse about migration and settlement. And you can let policymakers know what you and your service seekers need. How can you provide the most effective services? How can people who have power to change policy influence the settlement outcomes of the newcomers that you are serving? So the Community Knowledge Program is an initiative to foster collaborative research and sharing of knowledge mobilization within the immigrant and refugee serving sector in the GTA. We are funded by the United Way through TRIAC, and we came from the Center of Excellence for Research on Immigration and Settlement, which was a network of researchers, community agencies, and policymakers all collaborating on various projects. CIRIS ended its operations in 2019, but the program was moved to the Wellesley Institute and continues there today. So why is this community knowledge program important? Well, as you all know, you need access to high quality research. If you have high quality research that clearly indicates what's needed, that can help you build your case for effective policy, that can help you modify your services, and it can build your capacity to advocate for the people who are seeking your services and for newcomers in general. So the project began with a needs assessment, which I'm going to tell you about in a moment. And it has three components that are currently under development. The first is training for frontline settlement workers. And during the discussion, I will be asking you for some feedback about what you would like to see in such training. There will be a portal for like a one-stop shop if you would like to know what's happening in the sector on a particular issue. You can look for information there. You can contribute information about your own research. This is going to be a meeting place. And we are still figuring out the logistics of it, but we hope that it will become a place where researchers, policymakers, and frontline workers can consult with each other. There's forums for this already, and we will be working with them. And we'll also be offering something as distinct as we can to make sure that your needs as frontline workers looking for information about settlement, find out what you need to know. And lastly, there will be a set of community panel events. Some of you who participated in these during the CIRIS days will remember them. We will get researchers in who are doing work currently, and they will present their findings. We will have curated simple research summaries that will mobilize the information and enable you to use it in your work. So for the needs assessment, what's happening with research in the sector? Clearly, things have changed very dramatically over the past year and a half. We all know how much COVID-19 has shifted the landscape. Research has changed, practice has changed. Many of you have been working from home. The research work as well has largely moved online. The face-to-face interviews, the focus groups, the surveys, these are all happening over the internet now. So we need to know what knowledge the immigrant and refugee serving sector needs now, and what are the best ways to share it? How do we get this effectively into the hands of the people who can use the information to improve services, advocate for better policy, and make changes? So our key findings for this work. Obviously, gaps exist between research and practice. I don't think that's going to be news to anybody here. There's a whole lot of great research going on in the sector right now, and there's so much of it that many of you may not be hearing about some findings that could directly influence your work or reshape it. So timely knowledge mobilization, timely research is critical to effective settlement programs and services. What I mean by timely is that people could, if academic researchers are finishing up a big report about settlement needs, this could be included in funding applications. So if the research is being released at the time of the funding cycle, then it makes for a much stronger case to the funders. The third major finding was that numerous challenges exist, and we'll talk about what some of those are. They are within different parts of the sector, and they are between and among different parts of the sector. And finally, the good news is that there are indeed ways to close the gaps. And the community knowledge program is working on some of these approaches, and we are also very interested in your insights and thoughts and feedback about ways that you would close these gaps as well. So our needs assessment found that there is a whole lot of desire for research. Stakeholders, our respondents, indicated they want all of these things. They want information about technology, services on arrival, long-term outcomes, different interventions for different populations, policies and practices that empower newcomers. What I wanted to convey here is that there is a lot of room for research in the sector. There's a lot of desire for this information. So research is already happening on a lot of these topics. Refugees in Canada during the first wave, the impacts of COVID-19 on the migration system, the Canadian immigration system, the effects of technology, the preliminary report from the Settlement Sector and Technology Task Group to the federal government. You can see reports for IRCC here, reports for academic journals, but often this just does not make it to the frontline workers. So some of the structural issues that we identified in this needs assessment, we found that restrictive funding models often really determine, like they shape, and not always in great ways, how the research happens. Most of the research funding from groups like SSHRC and not IRCC specifically, but for academic research, go to academic researchers who control the funding. So community partners don't often feel like they are equal partners in the research, and they don't control the money. So they are less likely to want to engage. Also, and I'm sure this is no surprise to anyone, the emphasis on the short-term projects means that there is a lack of longitudinal data. One of the topics that we saw on the 2 slides ago was about whether the services on arrival in Canada have influence on long-term outcomes. And the answer to that is we just don't know, because there's no way that people can track it because there's no long-term funding. And the third major structural issue to do with funding is that research funding for agencies, and you've all seen this, is project-based. So if you want to get in on the service delivery improvements funding, you get money for just a year or 2 or 3, and then it winds down. Also, it's because it's project-based, agencies have to compete for it. And we'll see the consequences of this outlined in a moment. Yes, there's this fear. If you take my idea, you'll take my funding. This was from one of the key informants in the needs assessment study. So this competition means that a lot of ideas are not getting shared for fear that they'll be co-opted and people will the funding, it'll get co-opted, and they won't be able to do the work that they had the idea for. So I'm checking in the chat here, and question from Elham. And yes, I will be making the slides available. You should be able to download them from the conference website. And if you can't, my contact information is at the end of the presentation, and you can email me directly. Elham, your question about policy making and research. It can be, this is a little bit outside the scope of this particular presentation, but yes, it can be challenging to convince policymakers to consider a public policy informed by research. I suppose it depends largely on the who is in power at the time and their research priorities, but yes, I would agree that that can be an issue. So these are some of the comments that we got in the key informant interviews about what some of the other concerns were. The strained relationships came up a lot. Frontline agencies are really tired of all the surveys. They're tired of researchers contacting them. they feel like they give and give and give and nothing comes back. One of the terms that was bouncing around as I was doing this work was resource extraction, almost a very colonial approach to doing research, where people go in, they take the information they need and they leave and they don't bring it back. A senior leader of a very large multi-service agency in Toronto said, we do feel a huge chasm between us and the universities. Essentially, if we're not involved in the design phase and the planning stages, we're not going to participate at all. If you don't treat us as equal partners, we're out. So that is very concerning. Also, the same senior leader noted that the newcomer agencies would not have much interest in going to a research symposium where they didn't get about a particular topic if they didn't get to set the research question or participate in framing it at all. And also, there's often a lack of credibility for the research that's conducted in the sector, as opposed to by professional research organizations or academic researchers. A lot of the methods that are used in academic research are the same ones that are used in research by agencies, but the results from the community agencies are not often taken as seriously. This was a major theme throughout the whole needs assessment. The idea that there's too much information and there's not enough. What this means is that the research, there's so much out there already and it hasn't been broken down and put into easily digestible formats for people who are very busy. I know that people working in sediment agencies have a very high workload. You don't have a lot of time to look at what's going on in the research world. There is a newsletter from IRCC called Research at a Glance. And if you are subscribed to that, you might be getting 2 or 3 or 4, sometimes even 5 emails per day with research summaries about migration, settlement, and integration. Some of it is international, some of it is very local. Maybe not all of it is directly relevant to you as a service provider. So another thing that a key informant pointed out was that there's not a lot of professional development coming out of research, except at once a year conferences like this. And I know that a lot of you will make time, you will be given time by your agencies to attend something like this, but during the rest of the year, it's really not an option because you're so busy. So also, one key informant pointed out that the time to sort through potentially relevant information, the language level can also be key. Many people who work in settlement agencies are newcomers yourselves and may not have the academic level of English. Your English is perfect for what you need to do at your job, but it's not at an academic level where you can understand the journal articles and apply those ideas to your work. And how do you know if you should even start to read something? How do you know if it will have an impact on your work? And yes, I believe Miyuki just asked, does the sector also need PD around how to use research in their work? I would believe so, yes. And our training will be covering some of that. Yes, concerns raised about staff resources, data collection, high-level research meetings, consultations. Yes, that is very much a barrier, that you don't have the same access to resources. And that's something that we are hoping to address. So the steps here will be, as I mentioned, the training, the frontline staff for the immigrant and refugee serving agencies, the research portal or hub, and the panel discussions. So I'd like to open up the floor a bit. If anybody would like to ask a question, you can do so in the chat. You can, some of you have already shared. If you'd like to speak, that would also be great. What are your thoughts about all these findings? Do they match your experiences? And some of you have already indicated that yes. Yes. Okay, I see a comment in the chat. Many of us have large data sets, but don't know how to go about using the data. Yes, yeah. This is a big issue. There is so much data available. There are so many research reports available. How do we curate them? How do we understand what to do? How do we understand this data and then how to apply it to our work? Yes, Mariam points out, it always breaks at the application part. How do we get the research into practice? How do we get it into practice? There will not be any cost for the Wellesley Institute's training. It will be online. It will be probably a 6-module course. Yes, there is also a conflict of time between frontline service with clients and then working with data. Yeah, and you are working with data every time you enter anything into iCare. But there's not enough funding for data collection. As I was mentioning, you don't have the resources to engage in the actual research because all of your time is taken up with providing services. Anything that happens, and this was expressed repeatedly, happens off the side of the desk. So this is something that community-based research can definitely address. Okay, so for the Wellesley Institute training, this will be, as I mentioned, a 6-module online course with sections about a basic introduction to research. So if you hear all these terms being thrown around, like qualitative, quantitative, exploratory, explanatory, descriptive, statistical stuff, just briefly, these we will be including information about, just to make sure that you have the same understanding and vocabulary as the people that are doing the research full time. Yes, yeah. So it will also include information, the training will include information about knowledge mobilization and how to get the word out about work that you've done. So we'll be talking about the different stages of the research process. We'll be talking about developing the research question, what makes for a good research question, what can get you down a rabbit hole and maybe not succeed. We'll be looking at research that has gone off the rails and trying to understand why, and with luck, giving you tools that you can apply to make sure that your research is more successful. The consultation regarding open data. Yes, I firmly believe that the sector should be involved in this. I don't know if it is yet, but that's an excellent question, and something that I believe that we as a sector should definitely be looking into. Yeah. So any staff can take the training course. It will be available on an online platform, and we will be happy to provide more information about it as it becomes available. We also have a mailing list for the community knowledge program, and I will be sharing a link to that in the chat later in the session. Okay, great. Any further questions or comments? I'll wait for just a moment to see if anybody has anything to add. And if not, then I will move on to the next section of the presentation. Yes, there will be an email to contact. You can contact me directly. Again, the email, my contact information will be available at the end of the presentation, but I will also be, I can be reached at emily@wellesleyinstitute.com. Okay. So,
hi, Emily.
Yes.
Miriam. Hi, it's Miriam. It's nice to see you. It's great
Great.
presentation. Thank you for valuable information. I was just wondering if you would be able to share this knowledge and information at SettleNet, as we have great numbers of frontline workers and sector practitioners. So that will be a great professional development opportunity for them. I would be very happy to do that. Yes, thank you for asking. Great. The question that I have, you had touched base on workload and resource lock within the sectors, because that's the, like a great obstacles, I guess. It's like in terms of even to keeping up. Is there any research that's been done looking at the conditions for the past maybe 30 years or 10 years of how the sector's been changed and how that impact in terms of the growth of the practitioner themselves and being engaged due to the load of work and lack of resources? I know there has been work done on workload. I'm not as familiar with the findings of it, but I can certainly dig that up. And yes, there has been a lot discussed about how the sector is very much under-resourced for research. It's only the largest organizations that are able to have dedicated long-term research positions. And it's usually those, and we'll get into this in the next part of the presentation, it's usually those larger organizations that get funding for research from other streams. It often happens in, for example, community health centers. Access Alliance uses a lot of their community health center funding for research into working with newcomers. So it's necessary for researchers to have, for agencies to have dedicated research. And one of the ideas that came up, and there's more about this in the report for the needs assessment, which will be available very shortly. One of the ideas that came up is that the organizations could, especially in places like community hubs, have a shared research position. For example, they could apply for funding for a quarter of a position or half a position and share a researcher to work with different organizations, perhaps looking into the same topics through different lenses. So for example, if there's a community hub that has a settlement agency, a housing provider, and a job search organization, employment, how can the ideas and the experiences generated in these three different organizations cross-pollinate each other and further inform settlement work? Okay, thank you. You're welcome. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. So I'm going to talk now about building equitable partnerships. A lot of the issues that come up because of the lack of equitable partnerships stand in the way of effective informative research and the use of available data. So in Ontario, there are a lot of different groups engaging in research. We've got the academic researchers. We've got government engaged in research, all three levels. We have national and international organizations, such as the International Organization for Migration. We've got national groups like the N4 and settlenet.org. We've got the independent research organizations, such as the Wellesley Institute, the think tanks, the umbrella organizations such as OCASI, the networks, like the LIPS, for example, the local immigration partnerships have a crucial role to play in immigration and settlement research. And then the service providers. And I chose these shapes for this slide very deliberately because the image that I wanted to convey is silos. A lot of this work is happening in silos. There have been a lot of efforts, including CIRRUS, including a lot of what's going on at organizations and research bodies at the universities to have equal partnerships or engagement with community agencies. But again, there's still many, many gaps. So the academic researchers in Toronto, the main ones are at Ryerson University. There are two big centers there. The Center for Immigration and Settlement, they have a master's program in immigration and settlement studies. And then there's within that, the Canada Excellence Research Chair, CIRC Migration, with Anna Triandafelidou, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, who has come bringing a very international perspective to looking at settlement work and migration in a much broader sense in Ontario and in Canada. At the University of Toronto, work is happening on migration at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, looking at things on a very high level generally. The Factor and Montage Faculty of Social Work, my alma mater, looking at community agencies. There's some involvement with the Building Migrant Resilience in Cities project at York University, cross-pollination among the universities and community agencies. And then there's a lot going on as well at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health, looking at health outcomes and newcomer experiences. At York, there's the Center for Refugee Studies, and again, as I mentioned, BMRC. All of these organizations are doing great work. Many of them are offering webinars and research newsletters and so forth, but it is easy to drown in the volume of information. So how do you know what's relevant to you? Again, there's more groups, the Statistics Canada, IRCC in the federal government doing immigration research. We can see Pathways to Prosperity, P2P, a big conference coming up, Metropolis Canada, IOM, CHIO, the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, the National Newcomer Navigation Network. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with these. And then the think tanks, the Conference Board of Canada is doing quite a bit of research on migration. Wellesley, the Institute for Research on Public Policy, Canadian Global Affairs Institute, then we've got OCASI, the LIPS. There's a lot of players in the field. So how do we get everybody talking to each other? Again, as I mentioned, the largest Toronto service providers are doing research. Access Alliance, COSTI. I myself have been engaged in short-term research projects at COSTI, but they're only able to do that because they have the capacity to apply for the funding, to fund research positions, to mobilize the knowledge and make sure it gets out into the world. So what does research look like in practice? I'm sure you've all participated in at least one, probably maybe even all of these things. The research is the focus groups, the interviews, the face-to-face interviews, telephone, by Zoom, talking to key informants, subject matter experts who have particular knowledge in the field. Surveys. You get the survey at the end of each of these sessions. You get the surveys at the end of training. You get surveys about your work, OCASI's sector survey of all the workers. Needs assessments. This can be to understand what the sector needs, who is getting what they want, who is not getting what they want, and where the gaps are. The environmental scans, what's available, what's out there, are we duplicating effort? Has somebody already figured out what best practices are in this area so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel? Again, program evaluation. The forms that you give to your participants. Did you like this program? What could we improve? That's research. Analyzing the data. Several of you in the chat have mentioned that you have real concerns with this. You might have access to a lot of data, but there are concerns about who owns it, who controls it, who has access to it, what can it be used for? So these are some of the things that research can look like as it is practiced. So if you could just raise your hands if you have, if you work at an agency that has a partnership with another agency. Just a quick show of hands. You can click the reactions bar at the bottom. I see 2 people, 4. Okay. Only 5 people so far. Okay, and I see a few more saying yes in the chat. Okay, so some of you do. Do you have, who works at an agency that has a partnership with a university? Again, please raise your hands. Okay, a college. Yeah, colleges and universities. Yeah, so some of you have those as well. Okay, good. Yeah, it seems like more of you have those kinds of partnerships with universities than with other agencies. Does any of you work in partnership with government? And this is a bit of a trick question because so many of you are funded. Your programs are funded by government, but do you feel like you are in partnership with them? Is it an equitable relationship? I'm not seeing a lot of hands for this one. Okay, a few of you, yeah, funded and working with municipalities. Okay, good, good. Yeah, so why are the research partnerships useful? How do they help you? Okay, no reaction capability in the screen. Okay, thanks, Natalie, for letting me know about that. So if you'd like to respond, you can do so by unmuting, or you can enter your answers in the chat. What are your thoughts about why the partnerships might help you? Support, funding, absolutely. Peer review, yes. When you know what other people are doing and you can compare your experiences with theirs, it can be so helpful. Collaboration, exchanging experiences, yes. Sharing resources, absolutely. Absolutely. You don't all have a lot of time to do too much to find out about things from scratch. So if you have a small team and you are aware of what's going on in other agencies and other places, building on best practices, building on findings to improve best practices, holistic approach, yes, yeah, these are great. Expanding services, applying for grants. Yeah, if you apply for the grants and you have the evidence from your research and from the partnerships, absolutely, you can really strengthen your funding applications. So what can go wrong? What can go wrong in research partnerships? I strongly suspect some of you have direct experiences. Yes, yeah, unclear expectations, lack of communication, competition for funding, as we mentioned before, great. Unmet goals, funding could end at any time. You've done all this work, you've got all your data, and then suddenly the funder decides their priorities are somewhere else. Yeah, and competition as well. That's a major one. It's a major one. An imbalanced share of work. Yes. Yeah. Ownership, expectations. Who owns the data? Who owns the research? Who has the right to publish it? Where? How do you communicate about it? Yeah, these can all be significant barriers to success. So the usefulness, we've covered this. The shared resources are huge. If you have found something that is particularly useful, and I can definitely speak about this from my experience as a link teacher years ago, sharing resources with other teachers, other service providers can be so helpful. It's just a godsend when somebody says, hey, I found this article, made me think of your work, and I think you could apply it. Or if they know, oh, this person at that agency is working on this topic, I just found this interesting article about it, I'm going to share it. Different perspectives can also have great benefits. If you are a service provider and you are working with an academic researcher who has been studying the larger scale and the longer term trends, this can absolutely inform your work, just as your work can inform the research by the higher level, well, I won't say higher level, but different level researchers who will not know the day-to-day details of what you're doing. And then the access to the different networks. If you are a frontline worker doing research, involved in research with the university, you can get access to other researchers. You can get access to the networks of the people that you're working with. So it can be very beneficial. But what can interfere with success? As you mentioned, sometimes the goals are very different. Is the goal to improve services? Is the goal for a very broad understanding of the sector? Is somebody doing the research so that they can get published and get tenure and start teaching somewhere? Is it going to be used for advocating for different policies and for change? Also, and I don't think I saw this particular word, but power. A lot of what you are all mentioning is deeply connected to issues of power and power imbalances. Who controls the funding? Who controls the resources? Who develops the research question? And this keeps coming up. Who owns the data? Who can use it and for what? So we're going to talk a bit now about this collaborative approach, community-based research. If you are familiar with community-based research, if you have ever used it, please indicate that in the chat, or if you can raise your hand, please do. Okay. Seeing a few of you, good. Good. Yeah. Excellent. I'm very encouraged to see this. So for those of you who have already participated in CBR, community-based research, this will be a quick review and maybe a consolidation of the principles of it and how it can help you build the more collaborative relationships. So the collaborative approach has 6 main components. Is the research relevant to the community, not just to the researchers? Does it build capacity for the people who are engaging in it? Does it build capacity for the communities that are involved in it? It needs to use rigorous methods. This gets back to what one participant noted about the lack of maybe trust that people doing community-based research are actually using the rigorous research methods that give the valid and reliable results. The collaborative partnerships, co-labor, working together. So it's not just one side doing all the work and expecting the resources from the other side. And finally, 2 more points, the social action outcomes. What do we do with this information? What changes can we make with it? If you have these in mind from the beginning of your project, you are going to have a lot more success in the long term of actually implementing these. Of course, you could come along through your research project and realize we're on a very different path here. Then you may have different social action outcomes, which is fine. But if you have good ones, if you have some from the beginning, those can help. If you need to change them, that can also be very valuable to help your understanding. And finally, ethical review. Some of you who have been more involved in academic research will be familiar with ethics review boards. There are any research involving human subjects needs to have an ethical review, especially if there is a need for anonymity or confidentiality. If personal information is to be shared, there must be no harm to the participants. And there are ethics bodies that will help with figuring out how to structure your research question, your methods, and so forth to make sure that no one is harmed by the work that you're doing. So the traditional research, the outside expert parachutes in, defines what needs to be looked at. The report may or may not lead to change, but it might get the researcher some tenure or get a promotion. And then once the research is done, the capacity leaves with the expert. I'm wondering how many of you have been involved in research like this. Have you had any of these experiences where someone came in, extracted the resources, and left? This can be a particular issue in cases of research with racialized communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities especially. And some of you may be familiar with the OCAP principles that were developed by and for First Nations in research, the ownership, control, access, and possession. There are other research guidelines that have recently been developed for working with Black communities to prevent this kind of resource extraction from going on. For community-based research, there's a whole team of stakeholders. And yes, it can be much harder to achieve consensus the more people who are involved, but that consensus leads to a much greater strength later in the process. The stakeholders collectively decide the focus of the research and the direction of it. What kind of research question is useful for everyone involved? When the stakeholders buy in from the very beginning, they are far more likely in the long term to pursue the outcomes, to pursue the findings and to feel committed about sharing them with the world. And furthermore, the capacity is built inside community agencies and in the community itself for engaging in more research and knowledge sharing. So looking here at the differences between academic groups and academic researchers and community groups, there's a lot of similarities here. Academics care about what they're doing. Community groups care about what they're doing. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. Academics bring unique skills and experiences. Community groups bring unique skills and experiences. Both groups work in complex and very often very stressful environments. They have productivity quotients. A publish or perish, you hear in academia often. In community groups, you hear, how many clients did you see today? How many people did you interact with? How many interactions did you enter into eye care? Are we meeting our targets? They're often similarly overworked and they're under-resourced for certain things. Academics do tend to have more access to resources for particular funded projects, but it can be challenging to secure that funding. The big differences, there's very different specific theoretical jargon. Academics will talk about positivism and all kinds of epistemological ways of looking at the world, and it can get very confusing for people who haven't studied this kind of philosophy even. The accountability structures are very different, the bottom lines. The bottom lines are completely different. Did you publish your paper? Did you finish your projects? In settlement work, a lot of it is how many clients, again, how many clients did we serve? The different timelines, the different calendars, again, this can be an issue. And often they're not used to working with each other every day. They have very different ways of approaching things, and it can be tough to bring them together when they're not often part of each other's lives and work days. So community groups, these are the different things that they bring to the research. Community groups obviously have much closer ties to people with lived experience, because those are the ones who are, in many cases, offering the services. These are the people who are coming in for the services. They are the ones who are aware of what is needed. They often have strong experience with partnerships across sectors. There's been collaborations between, for example, community health centers and settlement agencies, between different types of organizations across sectors, healthcare, settlement, housing, employment, all of these. And knowing how to engage in such partnerships is a skill. Something that community groups often bring. Community groups are more able to apply research. What I mean by that is that they are the ones who have access to the service seekers who can give immediate feedback about whether certain approaches are successful or not. Communities can often bring cultural understanding, cultural contexts. They have access to some funding, such as with IRCC's SDI, the Service Delivery Improvement Initiatives, and the CFP2 funding from a couple of years ago for research at agencies. And they also have connections with the grassroots, so they can bring out some grassroots change. Academics generally have much broader experience. They've got access to different streams of funding. They have a lot of expertise about research methods, which can be very helpful when they're sharing that knowledge with the community groups. They've got the research infrastructure. They have staff. They have dedicated time for this. And they also use and are a lot more familiar with many of the theoretical frameworks in which research is often assumed to happen these days. Through frameworks such as anti-racism and anti-oppression framework. Frameworks can shape the entire approach to issues. And the academics will have a more theoretical understanding of how those can be put into place. Academics have access to a lot of credibility. If a community group is publishing a research paper and they have the name of a prominent academic as a co-author, it is far more likely to be taken seriously. Also, the academics have access to the ethics review process and they're more familiar with it. And often they can influence the policy change as well. So what can get in the way of partnerships? Sometimes, and this has come up, there's a lack of trust. People just don't trust each other. We saw that in the needs assessment, the limited resources, disagreements about how the resources are to be shared. Can we pay our survey respondents? Can we provide honoraria to the key informants? Who decides whether we can do that? The very tight deadlines and difficulty in syncing up the schedules. Other pressures, I'm sure you can tell me about other things that you have faced. The competing bottom lines, the limited knowledge, the limited capacity, especially in community groups, limited interest. What's in this for me? People may not see the direct relevance of something very theoretical or large scale unless somebody breaks it down and explains it to them. And again, the perception that the community-based research lacks credibility. Fortunately, that perception seems to be fading recently, and I'm hopeful that in the future, the work that we are doing and the work that you are doing in your agencies and collaborations with academics can help address this and reduce this stigma as well. So what makes for a successful partnership? These are some of the characteristics. A successful partnership is formed to address a genuine concern that is present in the community. If you're trying to look at something that people aren't particularly interested in, you're not going to get very far with it. A successful partnership builds on prior relationships, positive relationships. There's the idea from Aristotle about how no one is a friend until they have shared a pound of salt. The idea is that you have a little bit of salt. You're not going to eat 1 pound of salt at one time. I hope not, anyway. You would have a little bit at each meal, and it takes time to get through this pound of salt when you are sharing meals with someone. And over that time, the repeated contact, the respectful relationships, opportunities for connection, opportunities for networking, you will be able to build those relationships, understand who is doing what, build on trust, and that will improve the success of your research and your partnerships. It involves the organizations and sometimes even individuals as partners. I know there are several people in the sector who are doing tremendous work as individual consultants, and they have worked with levels of government, they have worked with LIPs, with not-for-profits across the country, and their perspectives can be very helpful. Successful partnerships don't try to do everything at once. Again, they build over time. The community-based organizations that are well established can start to build partnerships with academics. Academics should reach out to these smaller agencies and the community-based agencies who have the real world knowledge and the expertise of what happens when a newcomer comes through the doors. A successful partnership clearly explains who is in the community and who represents them. This is important. If you don't know that the person you're speaking to is a representative of the community, or if they promote themselves as a representative when they don't have a lot of trust from that community, that can very much interfere with the success. The solid process, the solid structures, and the leadership can be crucial as well. A lot of people in the chat were mentioning clear expectations as crucial to the success of partnerships. And by establishing the processes early in the research project, you are setting yourself up for success. The resources, the sharing of resources, the understanding of who controls what, that can be very helpful as well. And the opportunities for mentorship and for building skills. One of the emphases of a lot of the graduate programs and the academic research that's happening these days is mentoring and bringing up the next generation of researchers. So people who are new to the field. And these folks could be frontline settlement workers right now, but could eventually move on to more academic careers, or they could become researchers within organizations who have long-standing familiarity with the community, with the organization, and would learn the research methods and skills in order to bring that unique analysis to the work. So what's in settlement research for you? What can you as a settlement worker get out of it? You're going to improve your understanding of the trends in migration, in the best practices for serving newcomers, in how the work you do affects settlement outcomes. Are people integrating well? Are the programs that you are offering responsive and relevant to what they need? I'm sorry, my cat is having a bit of a yell. The findings, you'll also get out of settlement research, a chance to build relationships with researchers and to shape the research questions. One of the things that the community knowledge program is hoping to achieve is having informal opportunities for researchers, frontline workers, policymakers to come together, maybe a lunch and learn or an opportunity for discussion. Once we can start meeting in person again, we might have once a month, once every couple of months, a coffee hour where people can come together. One of the things that came out of the needs assessment was that people very much prefer the face-to-face contact. They prefer being able to talk to each other. Conferences like this, one key informant or I think a survey respondent said, I'm not so interested in the workshops at the conferences as I am in seeing my friends. And one of the findings from the needs assessment was that people have a strong preference for the face-to-face contact and for learning new information by talking about it face-to-face with other people. Another thing that you can get out of settlement research, findings that are directly relevant to your own work. If you are involved from the beginning in setting the research question, you know that the results will be directly relevant to you and to the people that you are serving. And finally, Data, you get data, and you have a lot of data, and analysis as well that you can use to support your grant applications, as so many of you mentioned, and to inform your advocacy. When you are working toward advocating for better policies, and we have heard in this conference from policymakers and from people influencing public policy how important it is to have evidence. If you can present evidence to your funder, you can present evidence to people who can make change, they are more likely to listen. So the next steps, things that you can do to build your own familiarity with the research. You can attend conferences and webinars just like this one. We will be offering, again, the panel discussions, and many of the research centers that I mentioned are regularly offering webinars. There's a podcast, Marco Campana's km4s.ca, the knowledge mobilization for settlement. He also offers a podcast talking about issues in settlement services and in the sector in general. There are webinars from CERC Migration, from BMRC, from International Organization for Migration. Keep an eye out on the mailing lists, on the websites for these organizations. Join the networks. If you should all be on SettleNet by now, and that's a great place for you to exchange, excuse me, to exchange information, to exchange knowledge, exchange ideas, learn from each other. These networks are in place. The National Newcomer Navigation Network, also a place where people are posting research reports. Subscribe to the email mailing lists. The Toronto East Lip and the South Lip send out regular mailing lists, emails with research sections. Here are some of the research reports that have recently been released, and you can look and say, oh, that's directly relevant to me. I think I'll go read that. And keep an eye out for the academic researchers, the independent researchers who have a track record of working with community agencies as equal partners. You can see in some of the research recently that has been published, look at who the co-authors are. What are their affiliations? Are they working on a topic that is relevant to you? You can reach out to them directly. They're usually pretty easy to find through their email on their websites. And stay tuned for the Community Knowledge Program's new resources. Teresa, thank you for posting the URLs for the resources that I have been mentioning, very helpful. So I'd like to leave the rest of the time for discussion and questions. If anybody has anything that you think that we missed or that you would like to hear more about, now is the time. So this is the URL for the program. I will also paste it into the chat. And any questions, comments, feedback, very interested in hearing from you, especially about more what you would like to see in the training. Feel free to unmute or post in the chat.
Okay, I see a question in the chat. What was the hardest part in your research efforts in our sector? That's an excellent question. I think the hardest part was not being able to bring people together in person. For the focus group, we used what's called the World Cafe approach. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the World Cafe. It is an approach where people are brought together to discuss a topic of common interest. They break into small groups. Each small group has a recorder and facilitator. And they everybody discusses the same question for about 20 minutes and then come back into the large group, and one person reports the key point that they came up with. And this is a research approach that has been used in a recent project I've been involved in at the University of Toronto. It was very effective in person when we were able to do that. And it was possible to do it online, but it was not as fruitful. I think people didn't get the chance to build the kinds of networks and relationships with each other that I saw forming during the face-to-face work. Yeah, so Teresa, I hope that answers your question. And Soraya, in answer to your question, no, there is no cost for the 6 modules of online training. So you will be able to register for it when it becomes available, and there won't be any charge. Yeah, Michelle, I really appreciate this question. Settlement workers are overworked. They are constantly asked for participation in research. Their voices are really important. And I would love to hear from all of you as well, your ideas about how to respect time constraints, but also make sure that the research contains the perspectives and the crucial voices of the frontline workers. Yeah, and the 6 modules will definitely be available in 2022. Yes. Miyuki brings up a fascinating question. And I think it might be a bit of, this is something I might have to take back to the folks at the Wellesley Institute and discuss it, because it's a very interesting one. I believe there is, yes, user-centered design methodologies in community-based research. The idea of CBR is that all the stakeholders are equal partners and can participate in the design of the question, the approaches, the methods, all of this. So yeah, I would strongly believe that there is that capacity, that room. How to build that is probably something that we will have to consider in the future. Oh, sorry, trying to through the chat. The modules are not active yet. They are still under development. You can check the Community Knowledge Program website that I posted before for a link when it becomes available. We will also have an opportunity on that website to join the mailing list for the program so that you'll get information about it directly into your inbox. So the training is paid for as part of the funding for the project. This is one of the deliverables that we will be providing as part of our contract with the United Way. For the government question here from Tyson, for government funded programs, do you find it hard to establish research? It can be very hard to get the projects going. Yes, often it depends on whether there is someone inside the agency
already who is familiar with research and who knows how to apply for grants, how to conduct the research, and so forth. To overcome this roadblock, I think we should address it on several levels. One can be in applications for funding. So during your regular cycles of putting in the funding applications, could apply for funding and advocate to the policymakers and to the funders for a funded research position within the organization, stressing the need for the accurate, up-to-date knowledge about how to provide effective services. Also, to overcome this roadblock, I think more could be done with allowing, with creating opportunities for networking, for getting the researchers, the policymakers, the frontline practitioners talking to each other. Who needs what, when, and how much? Once the academics and the community groups start having stronger relationships with each other, then they will start to know, oh, this person in Ottawa, for example, is looking at this particular research topic. Maybe you would like to collaborate with them. Making the connections. Again, the needs assessment revealed the reliance of the sector on networks and networking. And we're hopeful that by providing opportunities for this in the community knowledge program and by building connections among other groups as well, that this will start to move things forward for the capacity of community agencies to participate in research. Okay. Any further questions? Thank you very much for all of the positive feedback. I know it's Friday afternoon and you probably all have heads full of new knowledge and need some time to go away and process it. So if nobody else has any more questions, I will let you go here. And the slides are available on the conference website. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you all, OCASI, for the honor and the opportunity to present this information to you. And I look forward to connecting with many of you and to building capacity in the sector where you can all be equal participants and benefit from the tremendous amount of knowledge that is being generated. Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure and an honor. And please don't hesitate to email me if you have any more questions about the program or the work or the needs assessment and the link to the community knowledge program. Okay, thank you all so much.